This is Greg Troutline, and we're here today with Jen Armstrong, the Vice President, Government Relations for the Waterways Council, to discuss U.S. infrastructure spending, specifically on inland waterway locks and dams, which, as everyone watching this knows, are critical infrastructure facilitating U.S. commerce. So, Jen, just to start us off, can you give a brief career overview with insights on your responsibilities today at WCI?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. So I actually started my career about 20 years ago working with the Corps of Engineers. I was started right out of college, and I was a military on the military side. So I did a lot of construction projects for military construction, specifically at Langley, some of the Southeast Virginia military installations. After Katrina happened, I was on an emergency response team, and that's kind of what shifted me into the civil work space within the Corps. Worked at the Civil Works for a while until I ended up at headquarters doing their legislative affairs.
I'm certain that most, and I really hope that all in our audience know WCI and the work that it does. But can you give an overview of the organization and its mission?
Absolutely. So we're an advocacy group. We represent the inland waterways interest. We advocate for a modern, reliable, well-maintained inland waterway system for all of its users, specifically commercial users. So our membership includes shippers, ag business, um, trade association groups that represent labor. We have a very big, broad type of group that represents all of those interests. WCI primarily works with the Corps of Engineers as the federal agency that constructs, operates, and maintains the infrastructure that we advocate for. There are
Perfect.
two key pieces of legislation that we track and that we address our priorities on, and that is, of course, the appropriations bill, the energy and water development appropriations bill, and then also the authorizing side of things. So the Water Resources Development Acts, those are biennial every 2 years. Those are the two primary legislation. Of course, there are other pieces of legislation or provisions that are added to other legislation that we monitor and track, but anything that improves the efficiency of the core is what we advocate and look for to get these locks operational.
We talk about the aging infrastructure constantly, but can you put this in real terms? When you look at the U.S. inland lock and dam system, can you give a sentence or two that neatly sums up the age and the condition?
Yeah. So keep in mind that the inland waterway system is 12,000 miles of navigable water. 11 of that is fuel taxed for recapitalizing our locks and dams. The locks and dams, there's 218 of them on the system on those 11,000 fuel taxed miles, and 80% of those have exceeded their 50-year design life, most having been constructed in the 30s, 40s, 50s. So in some cases, they're almost double the age that they were designed. And so over time, the deteriorating infrastructure, not only because it's exceeded its age, but also it's not modernized to the dimensions or to the specifications that, are used by industry to best maximize, the cost efficiencies for transporting, these bulk commodities.
Let's get to the real meat of this discussion, and that's funding for the inland infrastructure locks and dams. These are obviously, as you know much better than I, multi-year, multi-billion-dollar projects for the most part, coordinated and run through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that depend on regular funding from the U.S. government. But before we get down to the nitty-gritty, can you give us the big overview, the 50,000-foot view of funding for U.S. inland infrastructure? And I know from being in this seat for 33 years that maritime transport funding receives scant attention as compared to road, rail, and air. But where are we today in terms of availability of funding and when looking at this from a historical context?
If you look at the overall appropriations process, right, it always starts with the president submitting their recommendations for that upcoming fiscal year. And unfortunately, for the Inland Waterways program, our projects don't typically make the budget, which creates a number of challenges throughout the remainder of the process. Primarily that we have to rely on additional funding provided by Congress. And there's a number of reasons why it doesn't make the budget. The biggest things is kind of this threshold that they have for projects that are eligible to make the budget. budget. And typically that is based on what's called a benefit to cost ratio. So for every dollar that federal funding that's put towards a project or put towards an activity, what is that return on investment? What is the dollar in economic return that the nation gets for that federal interest for that benefit? And there's a number of complicating factors in the calculation of that BCR that makes that threshold very hard to achieve, kind of across the board, not just within the navigation program, but within the other missions of the Corps. First is that for navigation, that BCR is calculated by transportation cost savings. So basically, these are the savings that you get by moving these commodities by barge or by ship versus another mode of transportation like rail or truck. Those are the only benefits. That's the only measure, quantitative measure that is included in that calculation of the benefit to cost. It does not capture the multitude of other benefits or other economic stimulus, other returns that are provided by the presence of these projects, but also through the traffic that transits the locks and dams. It doesn't account for the national security component, the military's usage of these other sensitive government uses, rocket boosters. These things don't get factored into this number that is so critical for making the budget. And so that's one of the reasons why. Also, there are significant contingencies added to these large, huge mega projects to account for a number of unknown conditions that may arise. But a big part of it is the uncertainty in receiving federal appropriations, right? Because there's no guarantee. And so they have a contingency aside to that. And whenever you add those costs to your total project cost, it drives down that benefit to cost or that calculation, which is already kind of flawed in how it doesn't really account for the number of things that really are benefiting from the presence of these locks and dams. So that's the first step of it where we're kind of already disadvantaged in the process. The second piece is getting the congressional appropriations, which if you've been tracking congressional appropriations and those discussions, it's becoming more and more uncertain and difficult to get regular order within Congress. But Congress has been very supportive of the inland waterway system. We are very grateful and very lucky to have members that recognize the economic importance of the system. And they do add additional, funds for the Corps for this that are not included in the budget. But it does have to be enacted. They have to be appropriated, and there has to be some kind of certain timetable that they get for us to properly plan. And so that's one of the biggest challenges in terms of the 50,000 foot, how the Corps receives their money. Once that bill is once the appropriations are made, the Corps will issue a work plan, typically 60 days after enactment of the bill, that outlines where all those funds, additional funds, are going exactly, and any discretionary funding that they had the ability to influence.
So, for our audience, can you just discuss the main challenges that you see to funding these critical waterway infrastructure projects sufficiently and efficiently?
Yeah, so it's kind of hard to get an appreciation of the things that maybe need to be done to fix what's wrong without kind of understanding the history of how we got here, because the process and the means by which the Corps receives their funding, if it were designed this way, it would be designed to fail, because it's one of those situations where it's been trying to improve. There was an honest, concerted effort to try to improve the process, but without addressing some of the overarching things that need, the root cause things that need to be addressed. And so really it's kind of snowballed into the situation we're in today. And so that history kind of really goes back to, the Carter administration. The Jimmy Carter administration is really kind of where you see the culture and the things that are present today, has its kind of original roots back then. Prior to that administration, the Corps was kind of very bipartisan in that people requested projects. It was very earmarked. There were a lot of parochial projects, parochial interests in particular things, but it was a means for congressional members to deliver actual projects that had meaning, that provided something to their communities or to their states. And so it was a very popular organization for earmarking for that purpose. Carter, having served as governor of Georgia, had some opinions and had some experience with the Corps of Engineers, and particularly some dams and other and water resource projects in his state that he questioned whether or not they were not damaging the environment, that the environmental impacts of these projects weren't really fully being vetted or addressed, but also questioned the economic return, the federal interest in these projects. And so he targeted and started really kind of gutting a lot of the Corps' civil workspace, and that created a lot of friction, a lot of pushback from Congress at the time, and a lot of the things that came out of that carried over into the Reagan administration. And one of those things, and even though Reagan was very supportive of the Corps, wanted to fund, lock and dam infrastructure, recognized the national significance, he was also a fiscal conservative and wanted to make sure that those dollars were going efficiently to projects that provided that return. And so one of the things that he did during his administration was he put in Executive Order 12322, that requires the Office of Management and Budget to really review new water resource projects that are planned before they get submitted to Congress to make sure that they comply with all of these various things and also with the administration's own policies and priorities. That worked up until there was a big event that changed how the Corps got funded. And that happened in about 2005, 2006. There was a new chairman of the Energy and Water Development Subcommittee in the House whose background was military construction. Now, if you're familiar with those two programs, they receive their funding in very different ways. It is supported in very different ways. It is planned in very different ways. And he was looking at the Corps of Engineers Civil Works program through the lens of MilCon and seeing all these wild differences that to him were inappropriate for a federal agency to take without direction from Congress or without approval from Congress, even though those things were what made how the Corps got funded work. And what I mean by that is the Corps is funded on an annual project by project basis. Typically they don't receive all of their funds up front. They only get what they can obligate in that fiscal year, which creates a big challenge when you have these huge mega projects, right? Because if you're building your own house, you don't do it with the money you have on hand one piece at a time, or else you're going to end up with a foundation and no walls, and oh, by the way, for a lot of these projects they have to maintain operability while they're being constructed, or they're very complicated. And so what they did was they took away the Corps' continuing contract authority and simultaneously took away the flexibility they had in reprogramming. And they were able to make this annual project by project scheme work by having the flexibility of moving funds when they needed to during the fiscal year and not being constrained to, one, a bureaucratic approval process, but two, the annual appropriations process, which even back then was still uncertain and not, guaranteed to be within regular order. And when they took that away, they never put those other supporting components that the MilCon program or that other government programs have, like a strategic plan that outlines the priorities, that has the unfunded requirements list, that has how they're going, the out-year funding needs for each project that they're going to take on, that looks at that whole program holistically and how are they going to fit in these things over time. They never put those measures in place, but they took away the only tools the Corps really had to be able to make the way they received funding work. And so that was that first big thing that happened. And then the second big thing that happened was in 2010 when they decided to do away with earmarks. They did the earmark ban. And what happened is now that Congress was no longer directing which projects got the additional funding, they put them in large pots for the administration. Not the administration, it was supposed to be the Corps of Engineers, the technical judgment of the Chief of Engineers to decide how that money got divided up amongst the projects. Now, going back to that executive order, and this is why that executive order is important. Now that Congress has kind of handed over all of its, constitutional authority in deciding how that money is allocated, they handed that over to the administration and specifically the Office of Management and Budget. And so the executive order that was originally in place to deal with planning projects that was not subject to budget sensitivity. It was not something that it was a technical factual information was now considered budget sensitive because now OMB and the administration has this bigger role in deciding how additional funds are allocated. And the consequence of those things has been twofold. One, when they took away the reprogramming authority, the Corps is limited in how they can move that money. So unobligated balances are accumulating across thousands of projects where the Corps doesn't really have the flexibility to move large chunks of it. They can in small chunks within certain annual limits. And they no longer have the desire, the motivation, if you will, to clean up all those funds because what flexibility they do have within those small reprogramming limits that they currently do have, they try to preserve with the funds they have sitting on these projects that may never be needed for those projects themselves. And so it's this almost like self-whipping like cycle where OMB says, I'm not going to give you more money because you have all these unobligated balances, but you don't have the means of being able to clean up those unobligated balances and use them for what you need. So they get kind of punished in two ways in the budget. They get punished for the BCR, and then they get punished again because it's like, well, you already have all this money sitting on hand, but really not functionally. And so that's kind of what's wrong with the Corps. And it's how do you fix it? Well, it takes everybody kind of recognizing, you know, there has to be a better structured space. And the other consequence I don't know, it's kind of goes to the transparency of things. You know, if you most core projects, and this is one of the things that Reagan did, one of the reforms that Reagan did, was he had non-federal sponsors, partners have skin in the game by providing a cost share match for these projects. Prior to 1986, these were 100% federal. And so by having non-federal sponsors provide a cost share and the real estate for whatever project needs there are, you have a vested interest in who is ultimately going to own and operate these structures for the most part for like flood control. When OMB kind of took control of all of this information, it impacted out your funding capabilities. It impacted the Corps' ability to say, here's what we need over the next 5 years in each of the next 5 years. Now that's important to a non-federal sponsor because they have to come up with their 25, 35% match. And their budget cycles, their approvals for getting that funding does not align with the federal appropriations process. And in addition to that, it's either they sit on a large sum of money in anticipation for the potential that federal appropriations get made, or they risk losing those federal appropriations because they aren't prepared with their match. And so for some of these smaller communities or states, that's a big chunk of money to sit on. Those are things that need to go to other things. So it has these secondary and other impacts that aren't reflected in just the cost growths and the schedule delays of the projects themselves, but they're actually impacting a much wider audience.
Yeah. I know that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is continually in the spotlight when these projects run longer or more expensive than planned. And again, the backstory that you just gave, I think, explained a lot to me personally and to our audience as well. But when you look at the Army Corps of Engineers from the WCI perspective, what could or should the organization be doing better?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that they can control and they can process improve within their own self that doesn't require legislative action or anyone, coming in and giving them the authority. They already have the ability to do that. One is treating the inland waterway system as a program. You have 42 districts within the Corps and they kind of act like their own independent bodies, right? And so a lot of times in the past, they've kind of competed with each other or they developed their requirements without looking at the program as a whole, looking at if I have a significant increase in capability for this project over here, how does that impact this project over here, which, can impact when that block becomes operational or when they must award a contract by a certain date to fit that critical path, right? So um, there's definitely some improvements they can make in managing this as a program. The other things, kind of do involve buy-in and support and prioritization by the administration, whether it be at the secretary's level or at office management and budget or within the administration, the higher, White House administration. And that is, supporting this capital. We have a capital investment strategy. It's a 20-year strategy that was developed between the Corps and industry, because who better knows which locks should be prioritized for recapitalization than the industries that know where those choke points are, that know where the biggest delays are, that know, which one, could best benefit from modernizing, increasing the dimensions to have, that greater capacity. The industry has that real time, real world experience. And together, the Corps and industry develop and update every 5 years this capital investment strategy. And this is also one of those things, unfortunately, that gets caught up in that executive order, and has been changed from the time that it was, drafted and submitted with industry input and the time that OMB submitted it to Congress. And that's another big concern with this executive order, right? But that capital investment, if we all start working off that same page and transparently update and very similar to the military construction program that has a FIDEP, that has a strategic plan, if we treated that strategic plan and 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 used it for its full capability and what it can do as a guide, you could see massive improvements, more efficiencies, you have more cohesiveness. You already have that cohesiveness within the industry, coming up with those priorities and coming together to develop those. But we need the administration and we need, everybody to kind of be working off that same plan. And that isn't what's happening. The other thing is, and this goes back to that executive order, acquisition strategies. There are a lot of tools out there for the Corps to utilize to help address some of these uncertainties, some of these risks that are in the contracting process, that the contractors end up building a lot of contingency, a lot of risk that they don't want to potentially assume, they build into their costs. And there are strategies that help mitigate those costs, that help mitigate some of those risks. Early contractor involvement, for example, is one that if you have a very complex design or you have a very complex site conditions, or you have to work in a footprint that also allows for navigation traffic to continue, these are very complex things that heavily impact how you do your design. And early contractor involvement allows you to contract with who may ultimately construct it, but get their feedback during the development of that design to get better ways of doing it, whether it be better means and methods, better materials, things that maybe the designers within the Corps are not considering. But in order to use those tools, in order to use those acquisition strategies, they have to get commitment from OMB. And that is a part of that executive order process of getting those approvals. And that's where we're seeing this bureaucratic kind of stifling the opportunities and tools that are already there that don't require authorization, additional anything. They just require support. So, you know, I think there's certainly things that the Corps can do to improve. I think managing this as a program and starting to look at it holistically and being transparent about what those out year needs are, because those are based on engineering judgment, construction sequencing. Those are not budget sensitive or, exposing any budget priorities. This is factual information. That stuff should be shared transparently, with the stakeholders that are responsible for advocating for these increases, because right now we're relying on Congress to, put in these large earmarks because they're not in the budget. And to be honest, it puts a lot on those senators in those states and those representatives from those districts, because even though maybe that infrastructure is in those locations, the commodities that utilize those locks originate from somewhere else, they end up somewhere else. And how those things impact regionally and nationally the economy is very complex, and it's not centralized to where those are being constructed. And for them to have to rely on significant earmarks, it can ultimately make it unsustainable, to continue this program and to stay on track and efficiently execute.
As I said at the outset, we met recently in Pittsburgh. They're doing some amazing work there on the Upper Ohio. we're looking forward to following that project at the Montgomery and the other locks in the system. But again and again, when I was there, I heard that the professionals, the Army Corps of Engineers, they were progressive in the way in which they run the project. So just to end on a different note, I guess, can you highlight where you see the Army Corps of Engineers improving, expanding to get this mission done?
Yeah, I think a lot of lessons can be learned from Pittsburgh and how they're executing their projects, and what is setting them up for success. I think the fact that they received a significant chunk of money upfront with the the bipartisan infrastructure law funding set them up for success in that they were also able to fully design that project, upfront and kind of know those challenges ahead. That's something that where we have other challenges on other projects, where there's a lot of needs for improvement. That's one of the biggest lessons learned is piecemealing the design and funding over time in the way that was really kind of didn't do any favors to the execution of those projects. So I think Montgomery on the Upper Ohio is kind of showing what the Corps can do when they're utilizing the expertise that they have in-house with the Inland Design Center that they have, and also having just come off of the Lower Mon project within their area of responsibility. They have a lot of transition of the same expertise, but I think that's really setting them up. So, um, I hope the Corps continues to share those lessons learned from all the projects across the space. Again, this goes back to that managing this as a program. Um, you know, they they're too similar, they're too connected, the system's too connected not to be managing it as a connected system. And so I think Montgomery is going to be a success story. I hope we can continue to keep it on track.